Greetings and welcome to No BS Baking. JP here. Today, as promised, we're going to talk about gluten-free bread. Now, I'm going to bust this into a couple of videos. This one was a little bit longer than I wanted, but as we all know, gluten-free bread is not an easy thing to make, and in the spirit of being detailed and giving you proper information, there's a lot of little things that I wanted to cover off. Today, we're going to be talking about some tips and some tricks and some options that you have with respect to making decent gluten-free product. I'm going to have a second video coming out because I want to talk a little bit more for those people who are interested in some of the new technology that's emerging, mostly being used by the industrial baking sector. But I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a heads up of some new ingredient tech, all for gluten-free bread, to give you that nicer volume, better finished quality, and the sex appeal that the industry wants out of its products. So without further ado, let's just get at it and let's start this video. Now, when it comes to gluten-free bread making, there is literally 100 different sites and channels out there demonstrating how to make their particular version of gluten-free bread. So we're not going to talk so much about recipes per se, but I'm going to give you some tips and ideas to help you make better product. From site to site and from channel to channel, you've got bread that basically looks somewhere around like this. A lot of them are what I would consider to be, they're very disfigured, and they're trying to sell it with embrace the differences. Well, come on. You want to be able to produce something that you can make a nice sandwich out of. And the only reason that you're getting differences is mostly because of your process. Let me explain. Now, when you find people that are doing it right, i.e. the baking companies and people that have got it all sorted out at home, you get decent loaves of bread. Could you imagine a baking company putting out a loaf of bread that looked like the previous version? It wouldn't sell very well. They had to get it sorted out. If they can get it sorted out, you can get it sorted out also. So when you start to think about baking gluten-free bread, you got to remember you got some options. So let's talk about those. The first option that you got is, of course, you could go with a ready-made mix. There's a lot of big brand companies out there putting out different types of bread mixes. They tell you how to do it, how to mix it, the whole 9 yards. It's all inclusive. You can should be able to make a decent loaf of bread directly and quickly from utilizing a mix. So when you start looking at flour alternatives, of course you have many big brand, all-purpose, gluten-free baking flours out there. They're ready to use, and they have all the tech and should have most of the things already inside it, like your binders and these types of things, to allow you to get more on baking instead of having to worry about having a right balance of the gums and all the rest of it to give you some type of leavening performance. So you have this as an option. When you're choosing a gluten-free flour, always best to remember that they're not created the same. So you need to really kind of focus in on exactly what your recipe is calling for, and always check to make sure that your flour is suitable for the type of leaveners that you will be using in there. As an example, if you're using only a chemical leavener, are you going to use chemical and yeast? Or are you planning to use yeast only for leavening? Very important to remember, and also keep in mind too, always check to make sure that it's a 1-to-1 replacement for white flour or standard white flour. Some of them will have other ratios that you may need to use, so keep that in mind. So it's also important to remember that when you're using these pre-blended gluten flours, you need to double check. Take a look at the information and the ingredient declaration that they have in there. Make sure that both the nutritional aspects and the ingredients work in your recipe. So, as an example, if you are using a third-party recipe and it calls for xanthan gum, check your flour, make sure that it doesn't contain it, or you could be in a situation where you're unnecessarily stacking with certain ingredients that will affect the eating quality and even the overall oven rise and performance of your product. So always keep that in mind. Good to know what's in your flour before you use it. And the third method is kind of building your own bread from scratch, or you found a recipe that you liked and you want to give it a whack. Now, I've listed a couple of the different types of flours that are here, but there is many more, especially in the nut category. You got these that I've identified here, and then you start getting into some of the other ones. I've just listed a few of them here. There are so many types of different types of flour used in gluten-free baking and the keto style bread. Always good to do a little bit of research. There's tons of information out there on flours and what the best products to use them in, and ultimately you'll find a recipe for that particular type of flour. So as I mentioned before, always check your flour. Even if you're buying an organic almond flour and you're expecting it just to be straight almond flour, it could very well be, or it could have some additional binding agents or some additional baking performance ingredients, some other types of flours or something like that that's been built into it a little bit. Always good to understand your flour before you start using it. All gluten-free breads need a binding agent or a binder inside there. So when you're using these flours and you notice that they're clean, there is no binding, you're going to have to add one in there. So do a little bit of research on binders. Some of the most popular ones, of course, are guar or xanthan gum, but there's many other binders that are used, and once again, depending on the type of product that you're making, always good to do a little bit of research on the binder that you will be using in conjunction with the type of leavening agents that you will be using, whether it's chemical or whether it's yeast-based. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is you should always check your flour for the hydration characteristics. Coconut flour, as an example, takes a lot more water. It will absorb a load more water than, say, almond flour. So very important to do a little bit of research again when you've selected a flour that you want to use. Always make sure that you understand the hydration expectations and any adjustments that you may require in your formulation to make a decent product. So which is the best flour to build my own bread from if I want gluten-free? Well, it depends on what you're baking and where you look. I mean, they're all different. The internet's all over the place on all of this. But one of the things that I will tell you is that it seems like almond flour is generally one of the most common preferred flours to use in gluten-free baking. So, but there's many other ones. Some people say almond flour, other people love this flour, that flour, another nut flour, spelt, buckwheat, all these types of stuff. Depending on what you're making, depending on the recipe, the flour that's best for baking is the one that you select and learn to use it. Now, baking gluten-free bread can be difficult, so I'm going to give you a few critical success tips to keep in mind for your next gluten-free baking day. Number one, always use a scale. Don't measure by quantity. As an example, 1 cup of gluten-free all-purpose flour is around 136 grams. 1 cup of 1-to-1 gluten-free flour is about 148 grams. Coconuts, 112 grams. Oat flour, 120. It's all over the place. Do not measure by quantity. Measure by weight. Ensure all your ingredients are brought to room temperature. This is really important. So everything, including your eggs or your egg whites, your water, everything is all at room temperature before you start mixing. Don't overmix your dough. There's a Goldilocks zone. You need to find that spot where you brought everything all together, but you definitely have all of your ingredients well incorporated into the dough. Generally, on these types of doughs, within 3 to 4 minutes, using a stand mixer, you've generally got your dough mixed enough. Spend a little bit of extra time to properly shape and seal your dough. For the batter-styled bread processes, you don't really need to worry too much. Those usually flow out in the pan, but even with those, make sure they're nice and even and not irregular, different levels in your pan. And if you're making one of these ones that you can actually handle, then shape your dough up nice. Don't leave cracks and everything in the top of it like I'm showing here in this video. Spend a little extra time to make it smooth, uniform, it's evenly dispersed in the pan, and you've minimized the amount of cracks and surface irregularities of the product. Keep your dough moist during proofing. Seen some people where what they'll do is they'll put their bread into a chamber, like a microwave oven or something. They'll put a small bowl of boiling water inside there to give it that extra moisture. These doughs are not like standard bread doughs where you can just leave them with a towel covered over on the counter. I mean, yeah, you can, but you really do want to keep these doughs moist and tacky during your proofing stage. And don't proof at too high of a temperature. You don't need a lot of heat. You got to be under 100 degrees for sure. And I would say that somewhere between the 80 to 90 range is a nice temperature for these types of breads. Don't overproof your dough. The amount of time for proofing is usually between 20 and 30 minutes. It's not like the regular breads that take an hour or longer. These are normally done in 20 to 30 minutes. Do not overproof or you will be subjecting your product to collapse later on in the baking process. And lastly, make sure you plan your baking with the right pan and dough weight to capacity considerations. And we're going to chat a little bit more about this as we move forward. How much or how little your dough rises in the oven or during the proofing stage depends on the formula. Many different formulas, many different stuff in there. Of course, it will depend on that. Now, it depends on the quantities and the types of leaveners. Some of these gluten-free breads use combination leaveners of baking powder and yeast. Some do not. They use all chemical or all yeast. Depends on your formulation. Now, the correct flour type also is really important. You need to double check this. I made a comment earlier. Check your flour to make sure that it's compatible with yeast or a yeast combination of chemical and yeast leaveners. Size and dimensions of the pan are also important. Too little dough, too big of a pan. We all know the story behind that one. Dough weight to pan capacity, also very critical. Nobody talks about it that I could even see out there, especially in the gluten-free world, but we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Now, there's 3 basic types of gluten-free breads. There's the batter style, which is literally poured into the pan, and you can see from this first image here that it generally fills up, it flows all to the outside and gives you a more, what I call a square, kind of a boxy type of a loaf of bread. Then you've got this one that's kind of in the middle. It's not really a thinner type of batter. It's a little bit thicker, and so you start getting a little bit more doming. Often these ones here, they need to be spread out and evened out with a spatula or something like that, just to make sure that it flows all out to all areas of the pan. And then you've got this one on here, which is what I call the paste or the dough style. And that one there is you can handle it. You can actually physically handle it in your hands. These are the ones that you need to spend a little bit of extra time to make sure that you shape them up properly into a nice uniform piece of dough in your pan. Spread them out evenly. Make sure you get rid of as much of the cracks and the surface irregularities as you can. And you're going to have better leavening performance and nicer finished product at the end of the day. Now, the big boys have got this all figured out. Now, we know that, and I've been doing some personal calculations here because nobody really talks about their dough weight to pan capacity. Now, what it is it's anywhere from around 40% to 100%. Depending on the recipe. The big boys, they're cost effective, they want to do it up good, and they're making really nice loaves of bread at in and around the 40% dough weight to pan capacity. And they're coming out with breads that look very similar to traditional style wheat breads, except they're a little bit higher in the scaling weight, or in the finished weights, as you can see here. But not so much. They're able to make this work at in and around the 40% mark, maybe even a little bit less. The home baker struggles at these numbers, and I've got a video upcoming here. We're going to be talking about some of the tech that the big guys are using, but that's a whole nother video, and we'll get to that in another day. Now, what I've done here is I'm trying to show a comparison with what we just looked at to what I pulled off of a very popular website out there, all about gluten-free baking. Now, I had to do my own calculations on this because I don't know what is going on out there in the gluten-free world, but they just do not tell you anything to do with their batch sizes or their batch weight, and don't really explain anything about figuring out your pan capacity. But what I did is I did the homework, and I found out that this one here is around 925 grams of dough weight that she put into this pan. The pan capacity was around 2,300 grams based on these dimensions. And so the dough weight to pan capacity is around 40%. Now, she's really shot down on the low side. She's trying to play up there with the big boys. But you can sure as heck tell the difference between this product and the product that we looked at previously. So after baking, I assumed that, you know what, even though she went with 40% dough weight to pan capacity, 35% of her pan wasn't even used. So this is the reason why her product looks like this. I don't understand why she's demonstrating it like this, but let's move on and figure out how to correct this. So what I did here was I just quickly used ratio and proportion, like any of you guys have noticed that of my video that I've made out there on this stuff. And I said, look I know that the scaling weight percent based on the pan capacity that she used is 40%. And approximate percentage of the finished loaf that filled the pan, I said it filled the pan by about 65%. So then what I did is I says, well, what do I got to get my scaling weight up to, or my dough weight up to, in order to fill the pan 100%? I mean, this is a Pullman loaf. You would like to have it to come up basically to the top of your pan, whether you use the lid on it or not. So quickly, ratio and proportion, 40 times 100 divided by 65, 62%. Scaling weight is really what I should do. Based on this formula, should give me 100%. Should fill the pan 100%. Now, if I made my control bread from that recipe that I got from wherever I got it, and I found that it didn't work, and I ended up with the loaf of bread that I just showed you in the previous slide here, I might just look at increasing my batch size to accommodate the pan, or I might find a more suitable pan. It's obvious from that photo, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, that pan is too much pan for too little dough, or that dough is totally underperforming. Now, I would evaluate my dough strength, and if I deemed that my dough was strong enough, I might just try proofing longer. Maybe it was a little cool in my kitchen. Maybe I didn't get quite enough yeast or baking powder in there or whatever, I might look at that. Or I might look at just increasing my leavening additives for the next time round. Now, if my dough seemed weak, then I would first start off by looking at my hydration. Always look at your water first, or the liquids that you have in there. That's an important place to first of all start. I might look at increasing egg or other ingredients that contribute to the gas retention and the stability of my product through the proofing stages. I might try proofing slower, cooler, or less time. Less time might be one that I would look at first and foremost, because in these types of doughs, many people have a tendency to overproof them. And lastly, I would evaluate my leavening additives versus proof time so I didn't get premature burnout. In other words, I want to have enough stuff that leavens bread in my dough to carry it through the proofing process and into the beginning of the baking stages. And I need to assure that I have enough of that in there. I don't want it to burn out prematurely and then end up collapsing my product. And that could happen just from simply having, a really warm kitchen that you're working in. And so that little bit of yeast that you got in there in conjunction with that baking powder is all happening. Your ingredients are warmer and this and that. And next thing you know, things have moved a little bit quicker and you just don't got enough oomph left. And after, of course, that stage, you start getting degradation. I would look at the mixing. Also, you want to be in that Goldilocks zone. This is a toughie. Generally, I would say about 3 to 4 minutes of mixing is kind of the max that you'd want to give these gluten-free breads. But every recipe is different. You got your batter style, you got your paste and dough styles. You got all these different styles. Always good to follow the recipe that they're giving you. But generally, with 3 to 4 minutes, you should be done. Try to find the Goldilocks zone. You don't want to be undermixed. You don't want to be overmixed. You want to find the place that's just right. So, as I kind of touched on it earlier, the work area temperature. If it's hotter, you need to move a little quicker. It's just as simple as that. And lastly, and not leastly, make sure you're adhering to the critical success tips and the flour facts and considerations that I talked about earlier in my video. All of these things all come together to really dial in your expertise with respect to gluten-free breads.
Thank you for watching the video. If you liked what you saw, please give me a like and a subscribe. It really helps me out as I'm getting this channel going here. And be sure to check out some of the other videos that I have sitting right over here. We'll see you next time. No BS Baking.